Welcome everyone. We're going to give everyone a minute to log in. We have a lot of attendees today. So hopefully Zoom can handle all this. I'm getting the closed captions up and running. Okay, you should see the closed captions up there. All right. And then I'm going to share screen again. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So we are back for, it's actually part 2 with Maria Bates. So if you missed part 1, let me know. I'll send you the link. I'll try to post it in the chat if I don't mess something up during the webinar. So we are going to be talking about beyond adoption finalization, special needs supports today. And I want to give a big thank you to Florida's Children First and Maria and Robin and Christina for coming up with such great topics. I mean, these are always blockbusters. I mean, we have the most people registered for the FCF webinars, so they really know what the needs are out there, and we're happy to share this information with you today. I'm Christy Bagalow, the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services, and you should see the closed captions up and running with the red live box if you want to click on that to follow along. And as I mentioned, we have Maria Bates back again today for another part 2 of the blockbuster. She is the principal of Maria Bates Law Firm, and her practice focuses on family formation, business and nonprofit development, and policy analysis and advocacy. So thank you so much for coming back again to give us another jam-packed webinar. We are going to hold questions until the end just because we have so many participants and she has a lot of information to get through. But don't worry, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. And you can click the anonymous box if you would like to ask questions anonymously. I do want to also mention that you should not share any case information or any personal information. This is a live public broadcast. Anyone could be watching and listening, and it will also be posted on YouTube after today's session. So we don't want you sharing any confidential information while you're asking questions. So just be aware of that. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to share the screen and pass it over to Maria. Welcome back, Maria.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks, Robin and Florida's Children First for letting me do this. I am always thrilled to talk about adoption. It holds a very special place in my heart. So as Christy's going to get us to the front slide there, this topic is about after adoption finalization, although when we do get to the place where we talk about subsidies, I will address some pre-adoption finalization subsidy issues. But for the most part, we're talking about getting all the supports after adoption finalization. Christy, you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So that's me and my 4 kids. So if you missed the last presentation, I am an adoptive mom 4 times over. They are wonderful kids and also very wild and full of life and adventure. And I have also been a social worker before I became a lawyer, and I've written home studies, was the executive director of an adoption agency. I've done interventions, private adoptions, done consulting work, and so I've sat on lots of different sides of child welfare work, and I'm also coming to you today from my farm in Mayaca City, which I really, really love and helps ground me when we have these really challenging cases come up. I am finishing my LLM. I am dragging my feet. I have one final paper due, which is a policy brief in child welfare issues. And so that'll be done. It's in business law from Florida State. My JD is from Stetson University College of Law, and my undergrad is from Eckerd College in St. Petersburg in human development. So why am I training on special needs support? So first thing is that this is an unbelievably complex experience for kids and for families. And even though I've been doing, as a lawyer for 13 years in this area, there's still so much that I'm learning every single day, even preparing for the presentation. So there's just so much to know, so much to understand. And then many of the people who are actually providing the services don't understand at all. And of course, one of the most important pieces for me is that in addition to being an attorney, I am a parent of a child who has special needs. So actually, one of my kids was statutorily classified as special needs, although I don't think of him as special needs based upon his mental health needs and such. But one of my other kids who was adopted privately is very much special needs. And so when I talk about these things that come up and I talk about how my clients have, are struggling. I mean, every family who has special needs in their family, they're struggling. And I know from my personal experience what that is like, the day-to-day of it. So my last thing to say is that there has to be more transparency in this process. And I hope that this training will provide that for many of you who are participating, whether you're a foster parent, adoptive parent, an attorney, a guardian, that you begin to understand the process better or know where to look to understand the process better. This is not going to be answering every question that you might have, but hopefully it will help you get to the places you need to get to. And I certainly, I will tell you an example. It was one of the most shocking things for me was when I represented foster family, the supervisor at the CBC actually came out to do a post-placement visit, and then in open court announced that the delay for the adoption finalization was because the family was trying to negotiate for an enhanced subsidy. And it was shocking to me and everybody else, but many of our families who are requesting enhanced subsidies for kids who really have extenuating circumstances are put in the hot seat. They are feel very defensive, they are challenged, and they really need more advocates to help them in the process. So, and then one other thing about this is that this is a crisis system. Like all of child welfare is a crisis system. And so when you think about like in the private adoption realm, we can focus a lot on making sure the whole process is great experience for all of our clients. We have a lot of time, more time to do that, but in the child welfare field, there's just so much going on all the time. And, the classic overworked, underpaid concept, more so, with COVID. And so when we think about putting all of this together and really defining what kids' needs, much of that is missed when they're actually in foster care. So hopefully part of this presentation will bring some new knowledge for all of you to be able to advocate for that while the kids are in care to get some of their needs met before they are even adopted. So next slide. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I want everyone to read these when you have time. These are concerns, fears, questions, and realities. And there's variations here. And these are of the adoptive families. And they vary based upon whether a child has medical needs, therapeutic needs, or dual diagnosis needs. So families are saying, how can I physically care for my child? We often see that more so when the child is getting older and they also have some therapeutic needs at the same time. There's, how do I get my child to and from the hospital, into our home, into the car? Do we have a proper wheelchair? What happens when the child grows? Safety concerns. What if my child is, not being safe for him or herself? What about for their siblings? How will the siblings react? Are they picking up on some of the same behaviors? Where's my child going to go to school? Should I be homeschooling? What happens if they go to school and hurt somebody? What if I can't work anymore? Can I afford to stay home? Should I get in-home support or residential? Get to the bottoms, asking questions like, will I ever be able to go on vacation? Will my marriage survive? Or if you're single, will I ever be able to date anyone? And is my life over as I know it? And some of the realities is just asking yourself, from a day-to-day getting through it is how many hours until everyone is asleep and I can close my eyes. And sometimes you're counting down and days, how many years until my child is 18? And I know as a parent of kids who don't have special needs, we ask those same questions, but it's intensified, 10 to 100 fold when we have a child with, severe needs. So at the end of that, then you left with feeling very, very guilty about even thinking these things. So I want to remind you that if someone comes to you and they are a special needs family member, parent, child, sibling, and they are asking for help, they are usually way past the point of needing it. So try to be kind and open up a conversation with them, and try to understand where they're coming from. Next slide, please. Okay, so today's training, we are going to focus the first half of the training on these 3 steps. And what happens usually when people come to me is like, well, what is a subsidy? How do we get, more services for my child, or something to that effect? But I want to step us back to the very first thing that what we should be doing, which is to discover and define what is special needs. Defining special needs will also have some legal terminology, but we as parents can also define what we consider to be special needs. The second step is to create the plan on how to meet the needs. And then the third is advocating for needs. And then the last part of our presentation will be sort of putting that all together and getting in more detail about subsidies and APD and the other kinds of supports that we have for our families. So if you can change the next slide, Christy. As you can see from the last slide, it was like 1, 2, 3. We're going to do 1, then we're going to do 2, and then we're going to do 3, right? So part of being a parent for special needs kids is that you become a master planner, right? But in reality, when we complete one part of the cycle, it turns the cog in another part of the cycle and then the other, right? So it's changes all of the time. We saw changes because of the pandemic. We see changes because of kids' hormone levels, their physical size level, because more trauma, more triggering, more identity development, sibling separations, all of those things. So even though you may identify at the adoption finalization, this child needs these things, this child has these diagnoses, that doesn't mean that that's the end of it. It means that in another year you could be changed. That medication also can change and completely shift a child's behavior. So keep in mind that as you're stepping 1, 2, 3, it is not just 1, 2, 3, we're done. It's 1, 2, 3, and they're all mixing together at different times. And sometimes once you get a service provider, you will have to step back and realize, wow, that's some new information we've never had before. Now, how do we put that into our plan and advocate for those new needs? Okay, defining special needs. So there are federal guidelines, and some people also use the language hard to place children. And so the origins really of adoption assistance, where we talk about like the subsidies and the Medicaid and all of those things that come along with it, is from 1980. The Adoption Assistance Act, and it talked about language about, creating conditions that each state would then specifically define related to minority status, sibling group, age, medical condition, physical, mental, handicap, and what they had done was looked at the statistics and child welfare to determine who are the kids waiting the longest. And so the concept was to support the family so that we can get to adoption finalization. So if money was the issue from not finalizing for a foster parent, that's something that could be solved. And it became, I think, over time from a practical perspective, to a place where we realized that having subsidies in the adoption world for kids who have special needs is crucial to them getting these extra services they need. And so it always feels uncomfortable to me. So if you look at Florida statutes 49166, it'll define exactly what our special needs definition is. And it does always feel uncomfortable to me, the fact that we have race listed in there. But the reality is that more children who are of minority status from a race perspective are waiting longer in foster care to be adopted. And so the goal was to help support those families and have more adoptive families stepping forward to adopt. The Florida statute, as I said, defines it. Then the DCF regulations and operations procedures also defines it. And then we have all these other definitions of special needs. So when you're looking at the disabilities community, you're looking at Social Security, you're looking at the education community, they define special needs and they look at children in a special needs context in different ways. And then there's family, parent, child, and society. So as I said to you, although one of my kids who was adopted through the system was classified as special needs, I would never classify him based upon his development and his his actual self as special needs, whereas I have a child who didn't meet the definition at the time of his adoption and absolutely is a child who has extra needs. Let's move on to the next. Okay, so here are all the statutes, regulations, procedures, and forms links. They're not everything, but they are most of them, and there's some resource links. The North American Council on Adoptable Children, which is called NACAC, as you can see in the resources section, they actually have an adoption assistance resource center, and they are constantly publishing new information. They have great resources, including an article about how to talk to your child about you receiving subsidy. I will never forget when one of my kids came home and said that somebody told them at school today that I was being paid to take care of him. And you know, you want to just cry when you hear something like that, because that's out in the community, and our kids are experiencing that. So they have a great article that's a starting point for you to start thinking about those things. They also have the reports on all of the laws related to that. And they have just great information. And they do have some other PowerPoints you can look into. Center for Child Welfare, getting into DCF's operations procedures and all of that. Also great resources. There's lots of data up there too. You know, you could spend months and months kind of going through that. If you are going to be advocating for your child who has special needs, or you are an attorney working in this area, you should look at every single link there and read every single thing that you see, period. You know, the statutes where it defines special needs for Florida statute is only one point. That comes from the federal guidelines, and the federal child welfare policy manual is unbelievably easy to read, and you should just read it. I would say it maybe is not as easy to read if you're not an attorney, but when you do go to hire an attorney to help you understand it, it will start making a little more sense to you. And if you're an attorney in this area, you definitely should be reading those. Social Security has some policy information about it. And then Florida Administrative Code is the next step. So we have the federal guidelines, we have our state guidelines, we have our policy procedures at the federal level, we have our state statutes, and then we have our DCF regulations, which is housed in 65C16. And those are the specific ones related to this. And the DCF operating procedures are excellent resource for you to clarify any language when you're looking at asking for adoption assistance or trying to renegotiate adoption assistance. It's all in there. The last one is the link to the DCF forms website, and the 5079 is the form for the adoption assistance agreement, which is the standard form. Okay. Oh, I will say, one thing I didn't put on there, which we'll send later, which is that the other thing you're going to be the other statute you're going to be looking at is the Florida Administrative Procedure Act, which is statute 120, Florida statute 120. And if you are going to appeal any decision you're making that has been made by DCF, if it was denied and you're going to appeal it, you need to understand those procedures. Obviously, if you're hiring an attorney, it's their responsibility to understand those procedures. If not, you want to read through it and start to understand what the next steps are going to include, and conversations about the procedures. Okay, next step, and we're still in step one, so we're still discovering things. So that's given us a lot of those definitions by statutes and regulations. But this is the meat of what I'm saying to everybody that needs to be done and is not done well. So the first thing when I meet with clients and I talk to them about, you know, identifying what they really need, not just, okay, somebody said I can get a subsidy increase and I need this amount of money. No, but I want to step back and look at what does this whole family structure look like. So do not negate your own observations and experiences. However, one of the most important conversations I have with my clients is about facing realities. So, you know, when you are a parent of a child who is suffering from a mental health issue or the traumas that they've experienced, it is very hard to watch your child suffer. And we oftentimes want to think that our children are more okay than they are. And sometimes we are so stressed that we recognize it, but a lot of times we are just living the day to day. And so we just, keep going, right? And people say, how do you do it? And you say, well, you put one foot in front of the other. But when you have to begin to advocate for your child's needs, you have to really open up and eyes wide open, look at the realities and don't hide from them. You're supposed to be getting disclosure that was talked about in our first session. The Dcf Disclosure Form has sort of the checklist of what they're supposed to be providing to you before the adoption finalizes. And you know, as I said in the last presentation about that, many of the lawsuits are due to lack of disclosure or inadequate disclosure. And oftentimes my clients are saying, should I be correcting the child study or notes in the file? So if you receive as part of that disclosure something that is incorrect and accurate, you do need to tell them that you want it updated and corrected to reflect what you've been provided, or simply if it's incorrect. Because if 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, we're going back to look for an enhanced subsidy, I look at all of those disclosure documents. I want to look at the CBHA, I want to look at the child study, I want to look at all the reports. And so you want to make sure all of that is correct. And, you know, as part of that disclosure is understanding, like when I say CBHA, what is that? It's comprehensive behavioral health assessment. So you are going to learn the acronyms. When you're provided those assessments or you obtain those assessments, the CBHA, your child study, IEP or other school reports, medical doctors and providers, your psychologist, neuropsychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, occupational speech and physical therapist, and more. But those are the sort of the core ones. You want to make sure you really understand what you're reading. So don't be afraid to ask the questions. What does that mean? What does that diagnosis mean? What is the prognosis of that? What do you think is going to happen into the future? Of course, they can't predict everything, but you want to get as much information as possible. And I also want you to read between the lines. And this is so very important, because when you're choosing to adopt a child, you often just see how wonderful this child is, and you're so excited to be a parent and all of that kind of stuff. But when I read a CBHA and I see, oh, mom indicated she was using these substances, including alcohol, and then I see lots of placement changes, and then I don't see any kind of assessment related to fetal alcohol, I think we have a problem, right? So I read between those lines and I think, okay, we need an assessment here to find out, is this a misdiagnosis, and is there missed opportunities for support and treatment? I think about it like, okay, well, how long was this child with the biological parent who was at the time having addictions issues, living in a motel? And I'm not coming from a place of judgment. I'm saying in reality, what we need to do is to figure out, what do we think could have happened? So if mom was highly addicted and she wasn't able to stop using and was using her funds to buy drugs, where were the kids? Who was in the home? Who was not in the home? Who was supervising? What were they watching? Right? All of those things. So you want to think about the realities that your child went through. And again, it's not easy to think about. It's very hard sometimes to face those realities. And I encourage you to not come from a place of judgment against their birth parents. I mean, one of the blessings of being an adoptive parent is, but for their birth parents, we wouldn't be their parent. And sometimes it's really easy to be angry with what happened to our kids, but we also have to find the gold nugget in their birth parents. But what you want to do in terms of this process is to begin to understand what your child went through, because that's going to help you paint the picture of their full life. I will give you my recommendation here on this from a policy perspective, but occupational therapy is unbelievably amazing. And the things that they can uncover in occupational therapy assessments is just incredible. And I'm surprised that we don't do that more often for kids before they are adopted, or as sort of part of the process, not just simply behavioral health assessments. I also want you to dig deeper. So I was talking to one of my families and I was like, okay, well, let's start looking. So I go on Facebook and I find, oh wait, there's a sonogram picture on the Facebook page of the mom. And I look back to the CBHA and it says no prenatal records, no prenatal doctor's visits. And I was like, well, that doesn't match up because we have a sonogram around the time that this baby was in utero. So, you know, you want to dig around as much as possible. Some people do DNA testing, they can do genetic analysis, you can try to find biological family, find out where their siblings are, what's happening. Sometimes that's about genetics, and sometimes that's just much more about what their experience is. And, you know, I'm a huge advocate for staying connected with siblings. So I think, you know, the other part of looking at this and identifying your child's needs is what age is your child, how connected they are with their siblings, could they be connected with their siblings, how can that help them heal their trauma by staying connected. And so, you know, you want to just really dig as much as possible, schedule time to figure this stuff out. And again, if you have a provider who is, you know, you're in there for 15 minutes, which is often very common, and you don't understand what they're saying is your child's diagnosis, you need to stop and say, I need to understand this. Help me understand this. Give me a website where I can find more information. And there's plenty of special needs Facebook support groups and adoptive family support groups online that you can go to, and people will share their wisdom too about, my child was diagnosed with this issue, and here's where we went, and this is a great provider, and things like that. So I guess my goal for you is to think about, how do you help your child be a whole person, like connecting all of the pieces of where they've been, where they're going, and what they need with their lives. And so that is by uncovering the information regarding what your child needs. Oh, let me say one more thing about that. Oftentimes we cannot see when sexual abuse happens. But when I tell you to read between the lines, and I'm talking to you about they're staying in a motel and mom's not being present, that is where those things happen. It's very easy, and it's more common than we want to face. I think that should be more resources in the community to help really identify if that's happened to your child, and to help them seek out services for somebody who's a specialist in that area. So again, when you're digging deeper, that is oftentimes one of the hardest things to hear about your child, but you need to have your eyes wide open about that. Thanks, Chris. You can go next slide. All right, now we're mixing up 1 and 2, steps 1 and 2, and creating a plan. So I said before, what you want to do is become a master planner. And I am super organized. I planned. I'm a single mom of 4 kids. There's no way I would survive running my own practice, having 4 kids, and if I didn't plan. I mean, I plan all the time. And this is what you also need to be doing. And so if you're not skilled, it's not a natural skill for you, this is something where you should ask for help, get a coach, talk to other people, find out what they're doing, but you've got to create a plan. And I don't want you just to think about what you can afford. I want you to start from what your child needs, and first discover what are the options out there. So you're going to, you know, create a plan based upon your self-awareness, your family's information. You have family training and supports out there. There's family coaching, there's family advocates, attorneys. I know we are often expensive. I always reduce my fees for foster parents. I know several others that do as well. Social workers. I mean, there are people who provide support services, and private agencies who also provide some wraparound services for foster care adoptions. Their wealth of information, very worth the value of their time. Doctors, nurses, you know, so on and so forth. You know, when we have kids with anxiety, you know, looking at CBD, you know, don't stop yourself from considering any and all options for getting their needs met. Even nutrition, right? I mean, nutrition would be a thing. For me, having my farm was a big part of it, not having the stress of when my son needs to take some time to himself, and he's upset and he's not ready to be, you know, in a space, you know, he can run outside and he's got 10 acres to run around on. That's been just a godsend for me, and so for him. So think about those other things. It does mean you may be changing your life. I drive all the time now because the farm is certainly not in the city. But you want to think about what will really work for your family. And respite and special needs babysitters. You know, I have had, as a single parent, I have always had to have people to help, provide for my kids when I'm on call, when I have to go to court, anything like that. And I've had babysitters who, I of course tell them this is what my kids' needs are, and so on and so forth. And so when he's having a breakdown and he's throwing something or whatnot, I've had babysitters who video that to say, oh, do you know that's what he's doing? I'm like, well, yes, I know. That's what I told you. This is what he's going through. And it's that's just what he goes through. But you've got to find babysitters who aren't going to stop and try to take the video. They're going to, what I had to be taught was the 3 R's, right? So we're going to, of course, and I just forgot what the first one was, but you are going to relate, you're going to regulate, and you're going to reason. You can't go right to the rational with them when they're in the moment. And so, finding babysitters and finding people who get that, who can figure out how your child works and what they may need, how to keep your other kids safe in the process when they're having a breakdown, like that is so important, because it gives you an opportunity to step away and have a break. And for those of you who are advocates for parents and families, this is something you should be telling them, that they need to find that right away, right? In the adoption home study process, they asked you who's going to be the guardian of your child if something should happen to you. That's sort of a far off concept for them. What you need to be talking to them about is, what are you going to do when your child is having hard times and you need a break? You've got to develop your community. You've got to create your village. Look for camps, look for after school events, go to the Facebook support groups. And then some of those things at the end are really just the supports, right? So sensory rooms and supports, just kind of like my farm, right? Can you set up, something like we have a zip line, he needs physical activity in ways that my other kids don't need. Are there things that you can set up that your child might need? A pool, water therapy. Is there things like that you can invest in to help create a situation where you are going to thrive and your child is going to thrive and your other kids are going to thrive? So don't think about what you can afford. Start from what your child needs. Next slide. And day-to-day advanced and emergency planning. So when you get this presentation within the next week, the PowerPoint, I'm gonna send you some of my files that I use, spreadsheets and such, to help plan. And this is one of the things I see missing a lot when we're looking at enhanced subsidies, is that people have missed getting to the nitty-gritty, like nuts and bolts. What does my day look like? What will I need to do to get through my day? Okay, at 8 a.m. I got to do this, and 8:30 I've got to do this. Plan it out. And again, if it's foreign to you to be a planner at that level, ask for help. See if somebody can help you design that. But I promise you, having that plan will help you be more calm and have figured out things like, we do need respite. And because when you're parenting and you are in the process of, trying to get your child this provider or that provider or to school or getting calls from the school or things like that, it's very easy for that to just take over your life. So you want to create your journals, calendars, spreadsheets, and journals. Let me go to the journals piece for a second. It was recommended to me when I was in my adoption process, and I am highly recommending you do it. If you are a current foster parent, if you are a guardian, tell the parents to do this. Even the bio parents, right, should be doing it. Teach them to do the same things. Keep a journal. What's happening with your child day in, day out. And now there's apps. I mean, you can track apps on, if your child is having an issue with continence, like what's happening when? Is it every night? If it's every night at this time, is there something that's happening related to that? Those journals and those calendars where you're putting those notes in, you can go back and really take a look at it. And you can also hand it over to the providers who can see, all of the, the common themes there. They can start pulling those things out. Did you realize that your child is doing this on, this day, and again, the same kind of thing on this next day, and the common theme is whatever it might be. Spreadsheets also. Budgeting is important, right? So a part of parenting is just figuring out how you're going to pay all your bills. So when you have to think about having a child with special needs, what you also want to think about is, okay, we've identified that we could, we would be, he would be in a better place if he had a support dog, right? Okay, so we have to get a dog. Is the dog already trained? Do we have to take the dog to a trainer? Can we get a, support in that? You kind of flesh that out. So create a short plan, create a midterm plan, create a long-term plan, and start putting those pieces together, because that's going to help you figure out your day-to-day life. So, and here's a concept, right? So in developmental disabilities, we look at it, and sometimes there's a developmental issue that can be caught up. And then there's some things that just really can't be caught up in the same way as we think, other kids who are more typical functioning, will be fine. You have to plan out and be realistic again about what your child's life is going to look like. I don't want you to be limiting them. I'm not suggesting you say, okay, they're never going to go to college if this is what's happening, this is the diagnosis. That's not where you need to come from. You just need to come from a place of being practical and realistic so that you can plan, but the plan doesn't have to define the cap for you or your child. You also need to be creating a plan for your emergency situations, allergies, emotional triggers, who's going to pick up if something happens at the school, write it out, give it to people that you can trust, phone numbers that they're going to call, all of those things. I know it seems odd, but be as specific as possible, right? I remember when I went to the foster parent, the MAP training, which was many years ago, I learned to create a map. So I created a map of my home for a child that was coming into the home, because I knew what my home looked like. I knew where the silverware was. I knew how things functioned, but this child was not going to know that. So in your emergency situations planning, you want to create that kind of map for how to handle these things, right? So if the 3 R's, like I gave you, is something that you do with your child, put that on there. So it's a reminder. If something happens, your babysitter has it, they know what to do. The final concept in this sort of creating a plan is thinking about the worst case scenarios and your future, right? So Robin at Flourish Children First, and there were a couple of other presenters, did this great training on the ABLE accounts, special needs trusts, and master trust planning. And so you can find that on, I don't know if it's on FCF's website, but it's on Florida Legal Services YouTube channel. You can get that, and it's super, super helpful to understand, what you can do with each one of those. And again, there's specifics, and they spend an hour and a half talking about those details. But ultimately, what you want to do is to get out of the crisis moment and get into the thinking about the big plan for your child. So if you've made an assessment, or if there's been an assessment made that your child will likely not be fully functioning on their own for the rest of their life, start thinking about that now. You want to have a plan for how can we help our child be as independent as possible, right? What will that look like? Does that mean they will always be at home, but they go to these other, daycare type programs where they have other friends who are there? Does that mean them living in, a program? What would that program look like? Where do those programs exist? I mean, be realistic, think about them, and look for them now, because you'll have time to do that when you're not in crisis and figuring it out last minute. You want to find a guardian that's going to take your place if something should happen to you, for sure. And again, there are plenty of attorneys that, we do special needs planning, and there's sort of the planning part of it, which is figuring it all out. And then there's the implementation of that planning, which is, do we create an ABLE account? Do we have a special needs trust? What's the will look like? Who am I going to name as guardian, and things like that. And you may determine that you are going to have a different guardian for your different kids if they have different needs and they don't have the capacity to handle them all at the same time. The other piece that I try to educate people on in terms of the adoption world is that you will have knowledge about your adoption that may never be written down, and you assume that you'll be there to share it when the time comes, right? A lot of people don't share, based until the child gets older, what they already know. And so I recommend to people create a video about, whatever you were present for, whatever you want to share with them, whatever because you don't want that information lost. And if you're not ready to share it with them now, just create a quick video on your phone. just telling them what your experience was so they have those memories. Okay, next. Advocating for your needs. So we're in step 3. I know I've already said it, to value the time of your experts, but they are experts. And so even your case manager may have a lot more knowledge than they realize, but right now, many of our case managers are like, you know, the tops of their caseload numbers. And there are certainly, you know, people who work in the system who, you know, are doing something wrong. But my experience is the majority of them care about what they're doing. They're there for the kids, and they're just really overstretched. So, you know, when you can appreciate them and value their time, try to find out from them what their perspective is, what they think can help. When you go back and look at the regulations, like it says that the adoption caseworker is actually supposed to educate the adoptive family regarding Social Security and adoption subsidies and all these things, but I don't even think most case managers know that much about it to be able to have that kind of responsibility. So I always encourage people that they should be saying, go seek out an attorney who's knowledgeable about these things. I've had very much the opposite experience, which is that a lot of times people in the system are afraid to say, you know, to get an attorney involved. And so we only get the attorneys involved at the very final last second. And literally, here's your consent packet, file the petition, get me the hearing fast enough, and let's get this done. And so, you know, what my thoughts are on that is value your experts, engage them as soon as you can. I mean, I have families who, I mean, I know that maybe 6 months out from their adoption finalization, but we have the first initial, you know, consult, and we talk about what they're looking for. When it comes down the road to asking for enhanced subsidies or things like that, those are things you can actually do on your own if you're a parent. But you can also have an attorney represent you. And some of the value, of course, in hiring an attorney is that you really are in many ways handing things over to that attorney, and you get to be parent. And you can worry about being a parent day to day and let your attorney handle the workload. The guardian ad litem have so much possibility for educating the families on these options and pushing the system forward in terms of getting kids' needs met. I mean, I have unfortunately been paid to review many files. Review emails, review CBHAs, review child studies, review all of those things. And I see the inconsistencies, and I see in taking a little bit of time to read through it that things are missed. And the guardian, certainly the attorney ad litem, both should be out there advocating to say, you know, well, if I see that mom had alcohol exposure in utero, why aren't we getting an assessment? So you want to be able to do that. Some states, the guardian actually, I've seen them be involved in the enhanced subsidy process. I have not seen that in our state, but I've seen it done in other states. So engage your experts, and they can train you on how to advocate for your needs, right? And they can also advocate for your needs. Keep researching and connect with providers and in the community. So those support groups, Facebook groups are so invaluable. They're, you know, people will say this, you know, I love this pediatrician. I went to this developmental pediatrician. We're doing this thing for schooling. One of my kids has been in homeschool since in kindergarten, and so we do for to unschoolers. And people say this is, you know, that really works for me. Other people do game schooling. Other people say it was worth the drive to go all the way to Shands for this specialist, or we flew out of the state to go to this specialist on fetal alcohol issues. We brought this neuropsychologist in. So keep researching who's available and what's available in your community, and get opinions from other people who've used their services. This third one here, don't be afraid to escalate the situation to a higher up. This is one of the trickiest parts of these situations. So pre-finalization, when your child is not legally finalized, is where the most fear I see from my clients, right? So this is where they're so afraid that if we don't just agree, that they're going to remove the child from me. And this is very real fear. This does happen sometimes. If you are in a negotiation for an enhanced subsidy, the attorney could actually file like kind of like an injunction, right, so that the child cannot be moved pending this negotiation. I've never had to do that. I've never seen it have to be done. I know it's possible. So, you know, I talk strategy all the time with my clients about this kind of stuff, and sometimes we do put it off. And part of that equation is, does the foster parent want to maintain their license, you know, after this adoption? You know, retaliation does occur. I will say in my experience that child welfare is ruled a lot by power and control issues. And so, and there's certainly a sense of like outsiders coming into it aren't very welcome. So, you know, it makes sense to me why our families are afraid to escalate it up, but part of advocacy is escalating it up. It is saying, I don't think this is right, and I need this to be better, and I'm not understanding this. And it doesn't have to be forceful or mean. I mean, sometimes it is very zealous advocacy, but sometimes it's really just sort of help me understand and demand that they help you understand. And go read those regulations, go read those operations procedures. And if it's not right, then you need to challenge it. The next one, Baker Act, Marchman Act, temporary foster placement, respite, residential treatment. So just in general, you can look up the specifics there to see how the systems work. But the Baker Act is for keeping someone safe from themselves or safe for the safety of others. And it's a temporary, in essence, temporary holding for mental health purposes. And if you have an experience for kids who have therapeutic needs and lots of trauma, Baker Act is fairly common part of your experience. So read about it, learn about it, and understand how that process works. Marchman Act is for substance use and abuse, and it's very similar to the Baker Act, but it's a way to get services based upon substance use. There is temporary foster placement. I've actually never seen a family do it personally, but there is that possibility of having sort of temporary placement, a voluntary placement. Certainly respite, like as I mentioned earlier, is very, very important. And then residential treatment. You know, all of those things that I'm talking about right in that category are about having your child be in a different place than you to get their needs met. And as a parent, it is often very, very hard to have your child be far away from you. Sometimes you recognize you need it and they need it, but it can be very, very hard. You don't know what's happening. You're not in control. You wonder if they're okay. You have a greater likelihood of there being, you know, abuse in residential facilities or anything like that. So again, as much as you can learn about that now in advance of you needing it, the better you will be. And I certainly think that the guardian, again, and the attorney ad litem for the kids, like these are things to know about so that you can help prepare if you see that those things are possibilities for this child. Advocating also includes applying for other benefits, supports, and enhanced adoption subsidy, which we're going to get into next. And then I think, you know, the worst case scenarios are adoption disruption, which is pre-finalization, or adoption dissolution, which means the adoption has finalized and we are, you know, for whatever reason, you are no longer able to parent this child. Now, sometimes we see that as more of a voluntary choice because it's the only way to get the child's services. But sometimes it's because a family has to make a decision about there's extreme behaviors that are very dangerous to the household, and they don't have enough services, and there really are such a lack of services for kids with extreme severe emotional needs. And so that sometimes we see that. I mean, obviously we see sometimes adoption dissolutions where something has gone wrong and the adoptive parents are on the wrong side of the law. But sometimes we see it because there's been just you're trying to get your services for your kids' needs. Sometimes what happens in the process of advocating for any of these things is we realize that there was a non-disclosure about something from the agency. So they were aware that a child had specific experiences or traumas that they did not tell the adoptive family, and where we get this sort of concept of wrongful adoption, right? So it's sort of a going back on the adoption based upon the fact that the agency didn't disclose all of the information to help that family truly assess whether or not they could parent that child. Those three in that category are the most painful experiences for most people, and you don't want to end up there, which is, you know, why I try to tell people, like, you want attorneys who are experienced in this area. Like, sometimes it means that we do push back. I mean, I had received, for example, the biohistory forms on an adoption consent, and it said unknown in all these places. And I was like, this is not, I know this information is not unknown because the case is 2 years old. I could tell you what the color of the hair is of the birth father. And I pushed on it and said, I want you to go back and look and make sure that it's complete. And you want experienced attorneys advocating, even though it's a bit of a thorn in your side, because what happens if you miss something? And it's missed all the time. If any of you have written child studies, I know I used to, when I ran my agency, we did child studies with the CBC and as a subcontracted private entity, and supervising those child studies. I mean, they're massive case files, and it's very easy to miss things, but you have to be meticulous in this. You've got to pay attention. So if you're on that side of it, if you're presenting a GAL report, a guardian report to the court, anything like that, do your very best to make sure it is as accurate as possible, because as we peel that back, when we get to a problem state in the future, all of those things will be scrutinized. And you want to have providers, you want to have attorneys who are knowledgeable, who are pushing and making sure that the information is complete and correct. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So now we're going to put it all together. And we're going to kind of get into the real information about subsidies and stuff, because putting it all together means that you have now identified what your child needs. You have begun to uncover what things you know, what things you don't know, and then you found and create a plan for how you're going to see providers to make assessments, and then, you know, then you've advocated for that. So enhanced subsidies or SSI or things like that. That is all about making sure we meet their needs. So affording the provider services and specialists, right? So because my child with special needs didn't qualify as that when I adopted him, I don't have subsidies, I don't have Medicaid for him and things like that. So I've always navigated those things from a private pay or, you know, another system. And I also chose to homeschool him instead of doing, you know, going further down the line with an IEP, for example. That's what worked for me and what worked for my child and what worked for my family. Obviously, plenty of people can't do that. So these are the kinds of, you know, systems and supports that we can put together. So adoption subsidies, and we're going to talk all about the various pieces of that in a minute. Health and dental insurance, you would be absolutely surprised, many people, how dental actually does play a role. So when you have a subsidy, you're going to get Medicaid. You can also add your private health insurance, and then there's obviously other insurance. The benefits of insurance is obviously it takes some stress off of you if something does occur and you have insurance to help pay for it. You also have other government programs, APD, SSI, the Florida school systems. You have step-ups for students. You have post-adoption support services. You know, there's DCF regulation 65C-16.014, I think, is where it talks about post-adoption support services. And back in the day, there wasn't much of that. It certainly wasn't codified. And so now there's more clarity around that. So support groups in your community, a single point of access contact at the CBC that you can contact and say, hey, we're struggling, can we have some help? Other programs in the community, Florida Foster and Adoptive Parent Associations and all the local associations are wealth of information, your Facebook support groups. Also looked at community grants and or free or reduced fee programs. So, you know, sometimes you just have to pitch your story. And that's part of advocacy, is saying, look, is there any way that you can reduce your fees? I mean, like I said, I always reduce my fees for foster parents, and it's okay to ask for that. Adoption tax credit. So once your adoption is finalized, you can go check out that link from the IRS about what credits you're going to get. There's obviously other tax credits for just being a parent. So having a tax, an accountant or a tax planner who can help you like decide is, you know, part of your planning process. Like, are there things that we should be keeping receipts for that we can put in our credit? Figure that out. Sometimes estate planning, kind of going back to that slide, is that, you know, there are estate planning attorneys that are really focused on asset protection. And so you sometimes have to think along those lines too, you know, that you may be able to qualify for certain things, you know, if you are thoughtful about how you're spending your money and budgeting. And the last one, fundraising and private support. Make more money, flex your schedule, take out a loan, right? Like, that's just part of what we all do. Dip into your savings if you have it. You know, I had a client who really needed an enhanced subsidy to provide for a wheelchair and other stuff, and it was denied. And but at that time, she was getting a ton of community support, and her son set something up, and it just took off from there. And so she got what she needed. So, you know, sometimes you do have to just reach in and see, how can we ask for help, you know? And I guarantee you, this is a time where you don't need to be quiet about it. You know, you really need to say, these are the things that I need. This is part of you also building your village, right? To help provide for your family and your child, is to say to people, hey, do you have a, you know, do you have used clothes? You know, I mean, hand-me-down clothes that we can use instead of spending money on new clothes. So you scrimp and save in that area. That's sort of the reality of it, right? Because subsidies and everything else may not add up. Okay. All right, next slide. We're going to go through each of these sections. So what is subsidy? And let me actually, before I jump into that, I've been talking for almost an hour, so I'm going to pause for just a second, get a sip of water, and if there's anything, Robin or Christy, that questions that are appropriate for me to answer now, I will.
We have one question that came in, if you feel like addressing it now, although you're supposed to be resting your voice. It's a long time to talk. It's such great information. Someone was asking if a diagnosis of ADHD and a child attending speech therapy qualifies as a disability or special needs.
Depends on what you're defining it as, right? So for a social security perspective, potentially, as you put the things together, I don't think any one of them is going to qualify in that category. And, you know, are they statutorily already defined as special needs for the adoption subsidy piece? Most likely, and we'll jump into that for the eligibility portion next. So it just depends on what category you're looking at is special needs. Would I, as a parent, say is that your child has special needs? Absolutely. You're going to have to think outside the box. You're going to have to figure out, do we get, you know, sensory related things for my child to have accommodations for in school? Yes. Do you go to an IEP versus a 504? So that's some of the school related stuff that you could look at to help your child. But I would classify it as that. Again, it depends on where you're trying to apply for services, whether they define it as such.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Robin, for helping me keep up with the chat and everything. I apologize for not being able to post all the links, but I can't see much when I'm running a PowerPoint, and I'm afraid I'm going to accidentally end the webinar for everyone. So thank you for your patience, everyone, but we'll definitely send everything out by Friday or next week at the latest with all the links we've talked about.
Yes. All right, so generally we all call subsidy, right? But really it's called adoption assistance. And the concepts that you pull together is sort of the combination of what is your child needs and the circumstances of the adoptive family. And that's defined in the US Code. It's defined in the Federal Child Welfare Policy Manual. It's defined in our Florida statutes 49166. And then as you trickle down to operating and stuff like that, they're all saying the same thing, right? This is really about the circumstances of the adopted family and the needs of that specific child. So to gain adoption assistance, right? And adoption assistance is defined that includes these very specific things like your monthly maintenance, your medical, your Medicaid, your non-recurring, and I'm going to walk through each one of them. But one of the first assessment items is your child eligible? And so Title 4E or non-4E is a conversation that we have behind the scenes. And I will not pretend to know every little factor that is put in the system to identify if the qualifications are there. But revenue maximization, RevMax, is the people usually at the CBCs who does that eligibility determination. It's part of what they do. Title 4E means that the state is going to be receiving a portion of the funds from the federal government. Non-4E loosely means that it's not coming from, they didn't qualify for the federal eligibility, and therefore they're all coming from state funds. So what's important about that distinction is that, for the state, obviously the biggest distinction there is that they will either receive or not receive federal funds. So they are interested, of course, in receiving federal funds. Every state has a specific percentage amount. I think Florida's is like 59.6%. Robin may know what that is, but I think the last time I saw it was like around 59, 60%. So the federal would pay that amount, and then of whatever the subsidy are, and then the state would take over the other part of it. The benefit of Title 4E is if it's federal, if you moved across state lines, your Medicaid is going to automatically transfer with you. No matter whether it's 4E or non-4E, your actual monthly maintenance subsidy, the dollar amount, is still going to come from your CBC. But whether or not you can easily transfer Medicaid is part of that 4E or non-4E from a perspective of the parents. Most states also have ICAMA, which is the Interstate Compact on Adoption. I'm going to butcher their name now, but it's about basically it's the compact between states regarding the transferring of medical assistance, right? So most states, including Florida, is listed on there. And I think there are about 4 states who don't offer that reciprocity. And so obviously you want because it's better access for you if you ever were to move for the 4E Medicaid to go across. Again, there's a whole different reason for a child to be 4E or non-4E for the purposes of funding related to the child welfare department, but not as it really affects you so much. Well, I will say the caveat of that is that if it's a federal, you have a little more protections. Subsidy and adoption assistance is available whether you're adopting through the department directly, a private agency, or an attorney. But there are very specific rules and circumstances. The eligibility is determined when a child is placed through the department, right? And through thus it's CBC. But private agencies have, there's some different qualifiers. And when you look at whether or not you can get adoption assistance and, the subsidy, when it's a private agency placement or attorney placement, is typically you need to have SSI. So the child needs to independently qualify for SSI, which needs to be done. Well, it doesn't have to be done, but it's more easily done prior to the adoption and finalization. In fact, if there was no subsidy at the time of finalization, there is a mechanism by going through an administrative appeal to identify extenuating circumstances to show that they should have gotten, and they would have qualified under Title 4E, for example, and they should have gotten subsidy. So usually that's related to information that was not presented to the adoptive family, but there's specifics about that. If you are going down that path, you will definitely want to hire an attorney to help you navigate that because it's very detailed. Interestingly, there is in fact a private adoptions subsidy training piece about how do private agencies ask and request for subsidies, and we'll send that out, and it's on the Center for Child Welfare website. So that's sort of helpful if you come from that category. So don't think it's not possible. Back in the day, a few years ago, it was sort of, in my experience, known in the circles that you had to be a licensed nonprofit child placing agency to gain that. And you'll see a lot of that language in the federal guidelines, but there are the capacity to do it. And one of the caveats, for example, when it's an attorney placement, is if the child was formally receiving a subsidy. And here's an example. So when an adoption is finalized and the adoptive family's contract with the department for the specific subsidy, they sign the adoption assistance agreement, and the parents die, then that child needs to be adopted again to have that subsidy be put back in place. If that child had the adoption assistance before, then an attorney can do the placement and still get the adoption assistance for the new family. So that's one of the caveats. There's a couple of others. The place to look is DCF's Child Welfare Operating Procedures Manual. It is chock full of information. I want to talk a little bit about pre-finalization versus post-finalization. Part of this, pre-finalization is where you should be negotiating what you need for your child. But if you were the foster parent, the reality is you're not going to get any more than what you've been getting, right? And sometimes you have to argue for that, and it depends upon your jurisdiction. But there's a case that's pretty easy to be made, which is that if you've been receiving it, that's what you are going to, need going into the future. But it's not required. I'm actually, of my personal opinion, believe that we need to get back to really making an identification about what the families need, so that the state does have a budget to help families who do need much more extreme services, right? Because you have to keep in mind that the department also has a budget. I mean, they have to figure out how they're going to meet the needs of all of the children as well. And so it's not, sometimes they deny just to deny, and they haven't really looked deeper into the situation. They don't realize how significant the situation is, but they are still also trying to maximize their resources. And so the more money they spend on any individual child means less in their budget to afford the other kids that needs more extreme services needs, right? But if you are, if you feel that your child has new needs while they're in your care, you can make a decision that, we need to talk to our current licensing specialists, the people in the system right now, before we finalize, about making sure that our foster care rate is moved up to consistent with whatever new medical reports that you have related to the child. So if you found out something new that qualifies them into a new level of category, therapeutic or medical, you can do that before you finalize. And then obviously you could finalize at that higher rate for your subsidy. But that takes a lot of time. And my experience is that we don't want to delay finalization. And so people are kind of like, let's get this done. So sometimes what we see is we finalize and then we, can go back and request it based upon the new information that's needed. I have seen veiled threats from case managers about, okay, well, if you ask for that, I think I mentioned that story earlier. If you ask for that, then this is going to be a delay in your finalization. And that's got to stop. Like, it's maybe accurate that there is a delay in the finalization. Absolutely, there will be a delay in the finalization if we need to take more time to enhance the subsidy. But where we should be going with the subsidy is what, in fact, the law requires, which is truly a discussion and negotiation for what that family needs in light of that family structure and that child's needs. And to me, that's missed. And what happens a lot is that people just rate a certain number. The CBCs, by circuit, have made a decision that this is our rates for enhanced homes, whether that's therapeutic or medical. So if you fit in that category, you're going to get this amount of money. Well, that doesn't always make sense. And where a lot of times it doesn't make sense is when we have a kid who has medical needs and therapeutic needs. Because if you have ever experienced taking a child who has medical needs to medical appointments and they have extreme anxiety, for example, it's not going to be an easy process. If you have a child who doesn't have the therapeutic needs, doesn't have that anxiety, and just has a medical complication, it's a much easier thing to do and to deal with, because you're just going to a doctor's appointment, you get seen, and you go home. If there's trauma around that and they have all these therapeutic needs and there's triggering that's occurring, it's incredibly complex. So even though the system has created sort of these standard levels, what should be happening, again, by regulations, is a discussion and negotiation related to that child's specific needs and that family's needs. And, you know, when I work with my families, like, I want to see pictures of the family. I want to know what their day-to-day life is like. I want to know about what's the physical nature of your child versus you. I want to know about what things medically you're putting off. I have clients who are putting off surgeries because they're so afraid that something's going to happen and the child's going to be called out from school and they're not going to be able to provide for their child. Like, those things can all be, you know, like almost like a family meeting, can have a conversation with the caseworker or whoever's handling the enhanced subsidy request, to identify, you know, what does this family really need to do, well, to get their needs met, honestly. Post-finalization, you know, in pre-finalization, you also have an attorney who's finalizing the adoption. If that attorney is willing to advocate for you, whether you paying them an hourly rate or a flat fee, or they're just doing it pro bono, sometimes it's easier to get done then. And obviously there's some urgency from the state's perspective because they also want to finalize this adoption. Every month that the adoption's not finalized, they're also spending money, right, on the case, the clerk, I mean, not the clerk, the attorneys, the case managers, if the guardian is still on the case, right? The whole system costs money to continue to stay open, right? So, so there's somewhat an incentive sometimes to also come to negotiation on those terms, but it doesn't always happen. Post-finalization, you are going to go back when you sign the adoption assistance agreement, you're going to go back and they'll tell you this is the person you contact, and you say, I need help. You know, I need support. And that's when the enhanced subsidy kind of goes forward, which is going to be another slide or two. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. So adoption assistance includes your monthly maintenance subsidy, which is the dollar amount that you're going to receive. It could include, it will include Medicaid. And I will tell you, as the Medicaid to me is one of the greatest assets of adoption assistance. Yes, there is a struggle sometimes getting providers, but if you have a child who really does have more significant needs, the fact that you can get occupational therapy paid for, speech therapy paid for, residential treatment paid for. I had a family I spoke to who didn't have Medicaid and had an intervention case. And so even though the children were previously in foster care, they didn't get subsidies. And the private health insurance was paying for residential, and every 3 days she had to get on a conference call with her healthcare provider, not the health provider, the healthcare insurance company, and the provider of the residential treatment. And the healthcare provider, the healthcare insurance provider, would ask questions and make a determination that that child could be returned home within 24 hours. Every 3 days to go through that gets incredible amount of stress. So again, Medicaid is not perfect, but it does give you a whole lot of services that, you know, private insurance doesn't always cover. There's actually this thing called Title 4B, which I find fascinating. I really don't see it much, but it is sort of these other social services that the state gets funds for and can provide. And sometimes they fund adoption programming and adoption marketing things and stuff like that. Like, but it's the state gets these like pockets of funds, which they can determine, you know, how we're going to spend that funds ultimately for the goal of increasing the number of adoptions for kids who are waiting for permanency. And sometimes, and I know other states have used that fund to help pay for other specifics for a family who may have extra needs. There's also extended maintenance adoption subsidy now, which is wonderful, and I'll get to that in a second. And then, you know, getting the medical subsidy checklist, like that checked on your adoption assistance is really helpful. So if you have a child who has all these medical diagnoses, a lot of times, you know, whether it's in the child study or whether it's on the assistance agreement, to have that be present and known prior to the adoption means it's much easier down the road to come back and to get an enhanced rate or services and supports for those specific conditions. If it wasn't, there's still, I think you can still make a claim about it. It's just not as easy. So you want to make sure that those assessments are done before, as much as possible before finalization. Private insurance and Medicaid. So I have told, I don't think there's any time where I've said to my clients, quit your Medicaid. I have always said, keep your Medicaid. And if you want to add your private insurance, then you would have both. Medicaid has its limits anyhow, when you travel out of the state. I mean, they're not going to pay for everything when you go out of the state. So private insurance sometimes is helpful in that regard. If you also have a private provider who doesn't take Medicaid, because for physicians and specialists, Medicaid is also not an easy process. Their reimbursements are not very high, right? And they are required to take, so many situations. And I can remember calling about it for one of my kids who does have Medicaid and said, well, I want him to go see a developmental pediatrician. And they said, well, what's his health insurance? I said, Medicaid. And they said, great, we can see him in 6 months. And I was like, what? And I said, well, what if I just private paid for it? And they said, well, he could come in 2 weeks. And I said, well, then we're going to come in 2 weeks. And they said, no, that's not, we don't have a spot open for Medicaid. That's 2 weeks. And I said, you're going to make a space, right? And I just kept at it to the point of saying, this is ridiculous and totally wrong. And sometimes that's the advocacy you do as a parent of, kids who have needs. Because in my world, I'm thinking it going, 6 months is a very long time to get a developmental assessment done, right? By that time, your child has shifted in development and we have missed opportunities. So sometimes the benefit of private insurance is that you could also get to providers quicker, or to certain providers that have more expertise. When you look at the adoption assistance regulations, it is clear that the adoption assistance is not there to cover every possible scenario that exists. It's not there to cover everything. You are supposed to access the resources that you have or can have to also provide for your child. In terms of the Medicaid and navigating which Medicaid you're going to take, you need to review it. I recommend going and doing a health insurance consultation with the health insurance provider, so you can begin to understand, what are the nuances of choosing one program over another program, what they're going to cover. I have always been very fortunate in that regard of having, a good program, and I've never had any issue. But I do know that families, when Medicaid, like something shifts over, they're waiting at the pharmacy, and Medicaid's not going to cover it, and you have a prescription that's $1,000, and you can't afford to pay that today. This is those stressful circumstances that I say, if you can plan in advance for any of those things, plan in advance for those things, because that happens on the regular. College tuition. So Florida's Children First has a resource on that as well. In the last presentation, we had the link on that, and sorry, I didn't put that in this link here, but there's the very specific details about what it covers that does come with the foster care adoption finalization subsidy. If you are doing a private adoption and getting subsidy from that private agency, it doesn't always cover the tuition exemption. And the last thing I want to talk about in this, I think, is I want to go back and talk about non-recurring first. Non-recurring expenses. So what you'll see in the adoption assistance is $1,000 for non-recurring expenses. The federal guidelines is that you can actually have up to $2,000 for reimbursement per child for, it could be home study costs, legal costs, court costs, and things like that. So in Florida, they've determined that's $1,000. I would certainly like to see there be the option of that increasing if you have attorneys helping families understand subsidies and negotiating for these enhanced rates, or just helping them understand the process better. I think it's valuable for the families. I think it's valuable for the system, right? It does, again, when you have an attorney advocating for it to be done right before finalization, you have less risk. The agency has less liability, right? Because if it's complete and correct, it's difficult to come back and say, we didn't know, we weren't told, there was misinformation, okay? So again, federal guidelines is up to $2,000. States make a determination. Florida has made the determination that that reimbursement is $1,000 per child. In my experience, what happens is when you go have your attorney to finalize your adoption, then they pay the costs of the filing fees, the birth certificate fees, and things like that. And then once the adoption is finalized, they get reimbursed. Sometimes different attorneys handle it differently. So sometimes they will charge the family the clerk fees, but then will be reimbursed later. So that's, everybody does it a little bit differently, but that's what that non-recurring is for. Again, in the regulations, it clarifies all of the little details about what can be covered in that. And medical, let me go back to that for a second. If you have medical and there's something specific, so if you have a child, for example, that needs orthodontist work and you know about that in advance, you need to put that in your subsidy. You need to make sure that's in the agreement. And any other thing like that, medical equipment or anything that that Medicaid may not provide for, that you need them to provide extra for. Under Medicaid, you actually could go and appeal if they denied orthodontics services, but you would have to prove that it was a necessary, and not just a cosmetic purpose, but it's possible to do that. A couple things also about subsidies is that there are questions about what happens if the adoption, like if the child is no longer in the home and the child is residential. For federal law, the child going into residential does not stop the subsidy. There is termination of the subsidy upon the death of the adoptive parents, for example. If they are really no longer providing for the child and the child is in fact going somewhere else, there's some nuances to that. You need to talk to your attorney about that, and they will help you make sure that you're following the guidelines. I think that's it that we want to talk about in that slide, because we are just about on time. And I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers. Okay, so this is the top portion of the adoption assistance agreement, which again, we call subsidy generally. And this looks a little bit, this is a newer one. So, 5 years ago it was a little bit different. But you can see on the left side where it says 4E, non-4E, that's maintenance. That's your monthly amount, okay? And whether you're determined to be 4E or non-4E. Then there's maintenance with 4E and Medicaid only. So I've seen that more in the private adoption world where the family doesn't need a monthly stipend basically, but they are qualifying to get Medicaid. And if the child has increased needs in the future, they could certainly come back and request additional funds. Again, that's also in the non-4E category. There is a Tanf adoption assistance, and there are specific requirements from that. RevMax would have all of that knowledge about what that is. Medical assistance, if you have negotiated a certain thing for what you're getting for additional medical assistance, that might be listed there. Obviously, Medicaid would be yes. And then legal costs, and that total projected cost is non-recurring, and usually it's the $1,000 because you're going to sign, agreements can be signed per child. On the right side, they also have reason for medical, psychiatric, surgery, other. And and then down the middle section also says other. So I've had some caseworkers put in that other services, all of the diagnosis that the child has. Had some that refer to the child study. And my encouragement is for you to have, if there's a medical subsidy, that you make sure that you check off medical subsidy. There's also a new box for the extension of maintenance adoption subsidy assistance program. So before we get to that next, the rest of this agreement has more details. It's the fine print. It's as a contract that you are signing. So my view on it, and in the contract world, the person who drafts the contract is a little bit more in the power position, right, than the person signing the contract. And in really contested, enhanced type of situations, you could argue to modify this agreement, but pretty much this is sort of the standard agreement. So you sign it or you don't sign it, right? You check off the boxes, you make sure it's done. Down lower in the agreement will actually give you the name and contact information of the person you should go to if you need assistance for anything in the future. But it is a contract. And I always find it interesting that, of course, we're having adoptive parents, foster parents sign these contracts without, understanding it. The regulations require that the adoption case manager go over this and explain subsidy and explain Social Security to the family, and that they understand what they're signing on to. Well, I think in all my clients, I've never seen that conversation go any deeper than you're going to get this amount of money per month and you're going to get Medicaid and we're going to pay for your attorney's fees to finalize at the state rate. That is majority of my clients at the extent of what is being told to them, which is definitely not thorough enough. Which is, I always think we have an argument that, against the drafter, the foster families have less ability to understand this, process. Again, fact specific, but I think that's an argument that could be made regarding this if we could show circumstances by which the child should have gotten a medical, for example, subsidy, but then weren't, and they need it now. So, again, fact specific, but that's the top of the subsidy agreement. Now we're going to move on to the next. And it's probably, I think, the next slide is going to be blurry because I try to take a snapshot of this. This is the independent living benefit comparison table, which is created by Florida's Children First. It was in the last set, and you'll get it again with the materials once you get those in the next week from this presentation. But there are very specific rules, and thankfully, Florida's Children First has gone through and actually categorized how the statute plays out in the real world based upon your category, right? So I had a case recently where we're like, well, this child's going to be turning 16. Should we, in fact, wait another 3 to 4 months because it just keeps lingering to see? Because if we wait the 3 to 4 months and we don't sign the subsidy agreement until that time, the child may have the possibility of getting extended maintenance subsidy up until, past 18. And so this is one of the handiest tools if you are working with families who meet any of these criteria at the top. And again, this is just the one section. There's actually 4 pages in this. The adoption prior to age 16, adoption after age 16, and they didn't elect the extended maintenance. I mean, any of these categories, permanent guardianship, guardian citizenship program, you should be going through this analysis with every kid that you're working with. And I am a huge advocate for all children to have an attorney ad litem. And that is, when you have children who are, especially when children are older, one, after they're 12 or older, they're consenting to their own adoption, like, shouldn't they have counsel? And also because they are having to make some big decisions about their future related to services they may or may not get and funding they may or may not get. So, go look at this chart anytime you're working with families who meet any of these different categories to make sure you not missed something. And we're moving on to the next one. Okay. This is a sort of basic process by which, we go through a subsidy request or enhancement. And I will tell you the first thing I try to do is actually, if it's a family who's looking at enhancement, it's post-finalization, is I do a file review. So I don't take every case that comes in. And so one is I just don't have time for it. I am a solo practitioner and I do have 4 kids. But I try really hard to make sure that I get the family that is my client, right? I understand their family dynamics. I see what they need, and I think that their request is reasonable. But here are the steps, whether you're my client or you're an attorney out there and you are doing this work and you want to take on these clients. The family's identifying their needs. They've creating a plan of action and they're requesting services or enhanced subsidy, okay? They can do all of that on their own. In fact, my experience is that most of them do that on their own without an attorney, and only after they've been denied, then they go to an administrative process, do they oftentimes hire an attorney. If you weren't there from the beginning, you should go back through these steps with the family so you can get this full big picture. And that means if they've already done those things, you want to look at all the documents too that they wrote. So you understand what they were asking for. You understand why they asked for a certain number. You identify who the experts that are going to be testifying in your appeal, all of that kind of stuff, and what's missing. And did the agency do their job, right? So if they've subcontracted it out to somebody who really didn't discuss and negotiate with the family, and they really don't have any sense of what's going on in that family, did the agency actually do their job? In my opinion, no. I want to know all of those things before I take the client so I can, be able to advocate for my client. Second, family meets with a CBC representative to explain and work through how to help the child and family. And again, often this is not done well. That was my kind of pet peeve about this. Like, we should be recognizing our foster and adoptive parents as resources. They're not just resources for the children that they are currently having in their home, but their experience also dictates how many more new foster and adoptive families we are able to get, because we always have more kids than we have families to adopt them or to be foster parents. So anytime that we make the system look bad, then we are hurting our chances of having more families to take care of our kids. And I say our kids all the time because I really truly mean that. They are our kids. They're all of our responsibility, right? And so we should be very thankful for families who do step up to do this work and to take on loving this child and making this child their own. It's not easy sometimes, but that's often not what's happened. I think it should be more like a family meeting. Get to know you, kind of things that I do. I want to know about your family. I want to know what your stresses are. I want to know what you think your plans are for the future. I want to know where you live. I want to know the contents of your, not the contents, but I want to know how your home is. Does your child have a sensory room? Does your child have a place to have a space of their own? Are there other kids in your home safe? All of that kind of stuff. That person from the CBC should, I think, asking those questions, because how else do you determine the appropriate assistance that you can provide if you don't know those things? Because sometimes the adoptive family doesn't know either, and they are told go get a subsidy increase, because then they just get money that then they can pay for the services that they need, pay for the camps, pay for the family advocates, pay for all of those kinds of things. But you know what, you may already have a service provider in your area that is covered by Medicaid, and they just don't know who that provider is. So again, in my opinion, what should be being done there is what the regulations require, which is a discussion and negotiation, and really providing that post-adoption support services to help your families. It also gets to the liability issue too, which is the more you have families start uncovering and attorneys getting involved in uncovering things, you may find that there were incorrect, things put in the child study. You want your families working with you, because families are they're more forgiving about that, because honestly, every family I come in contact with, 9 times out of 10, they just want to love their child. They just want to help see their child be happy and thrive. That's what they want for that child and for the other kids in their home and for themselves. So when we put it in a defensive position, it's a fight, right? And so I know we're, attorneys and we advocate, and it's, an adversarial system all the time, but this is an area where we shouldn't be adversarial all the time. We shouldn't be throwing the baby under the bus just to protect our process. We should be helping figure out what's right for this kid and this family. If they're approved, you're good. You should be getting retroactive payments to the time of the request. If you're denied, then you're going to get a notice that DCF has denied you and that you have a right, because you had been a benefit denied to you, for a 120 administrative hearing. So 120 is the Florida statute, where is the Administrative Procedures Act, and it describes how that administrative process works. You have 21 days from the time you received it to respond. If the family responds, usually what we see is, they answer the substantive questions about what substantial interests were affected or issues of material fact, and they ask for a hearing. If an attorney has been hired at this point, they may go ahead and file a petition for administrative hearing, and they've pled the case in essence and included all this stuff in it. My experience is that most of the time, this is when they hire the attorney, and giving you my steps here. I meet my family. I see if I can represent them. I want to hear their story. I want to know who they are. I look at their requests that they've made, what they've reports were provided to the CBC. I want to review the original CBHA, the child study, the disclosures, the assistance agreement. I want to start identifying the issues. Did a negotiation occur, right? So sometimes we get there and I can call a DCF attorney and say, look, I just don't think that they got to this. I think these things are missing. And hey, let's try to figure this out now. Let's try to get this settled, without having to go on to the next hearing process. We look at, was the original notice regarding the child's history inaccurate or missing? We look at what the diagnosis is, the prognosis is. I have them complete my spreadsheets and my planning tools. So again, that helps me see the big picture. So I know, okay, well, are you driving 3 hours to a specialist? Have we calculated what that mileage is? Do we know if there are 3 camps available to you? One that's Medicaid covered, so it's available to you, but guess what? They have a 3-year waiting list. But there's 2 that are private pay, but you can get your kid in there now. Well, I want to make a case for them having that camp now because that camp is going to be helpful for them. I want to know all of those pieces. And then you're in the process of the administrative appeal. So if the family had already done their own request, I file a notice of appearance. And then as quickly as that turns around, I try to talk to the attorney to find out what did they understand, why it is that they've made a determination that that family doesn't qualify for that. And again, keep in mind that it's a big system with lots of people. And so because of that, they create a process. And those processes oftentimes look very black and white. Like, we pay this if you're developmentally disabled, and we pay this if you're medical level 1, and we pay this if you're this level. But in reality, that's something that they've created. It is not determined by the federal laws that stating that enhanced rate is this amount of money, and the state regs don't either. So you want to help understand, like, what is it we're really looking for here? When I have those spreadsheets, I want to see what are the costs of those programs. So what can the family afford on their own, and what do they really need help with now and or in the future? So again, my job, in my view, I want to meet with a DCF attorney and I want to talk to them about the settlement or mediation. Most of the time, my clients have no desire to go to trial. It's stressful for them. It's hard to get up and talk about that. My clients almost always cry with me at some point because this is not an easy experience, and it's hard for them to have to say, like, we're struggling and we're in crisis. Like, that's very, very hard for them to say. And sometimes if they say those things, they're afraid that they're going to have retaliation against them, right? If you can't get to a settlement via just negotiation and mediation, then you gotta get ready for your hearing, and you need to prepare your evidence. You need to get your expert testimony and prepare your clients. If it gets approved, wonderful, you go back. It's usually retroactive if if it was correctly applied for to the time at which you requested it. And if they deny it, again, you have other options. So you start again looking at, well, there are other ways that we can help get you these supports. Do we want to take it to the next level? Is this a wrongful adoption situation? Should we be looking at dissolution? So that's sort of my process that I go through with my clients, and sort of my experience of the typical enhanced subsidy process. A couple language things is that when you're looking at the subsidies and you think, oh, well, if they were in residential, they'd be getting, the state would be paying $3,000 a day. That's not the comparable rate. It's related to the rate if the child was to return to care in a family foster home. And that's 65C-16.01313, I think, right? So there's an increased need based upon the child's growth, the family's circumstances have changed or something like that. And you look at what we call return to care rate. So if the child were to return to care right now, what would that cost be? A note, again, I think I may have mentioned it before, which is that you can, if you never had a subsidy established, there is a possibility, if you complete extenuating circumstances, to establish a subsidy after the adoption finalization. But it's not simple, and you need, my recommendation is you have an attorney to walk you through that. Okay. it is past my time. So the next few slides, I'm just going to reference, and then we're going to get to Q&A. So the next 2 slides are about the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. And it explains to you on the first slide sort of who they are, what they do, and the disabilities that they cover. So I know somebody asked earlier, for example, does that qualify as special needs? And in this category of getting APD services, those are the disabilities that would qualify you. You need to know, even though you may qualify for ABD, if there's not some kind of, workaround to get you off the wait list, the wait list is very, very, very long, years long. So, and part of the enhanced subsidy, yes, they've now qualified for APD, but we can't get services because they're on an 8-year wait list or 5-year, whatever the wait list is. It is on their website how long their wait list is right now. The next page goes over the services that are covered. Pre-finalization, if you have a child who could possibly qualify for APD, make sure that this is being done before the adoption finalizes, because we can get them moved off the wait list at finalization time. So guardians, attorneys, if this hasn't been considered for your child, you need to have this assessed. You can't expect that the foster parent knows all of these things because they're not being trained on it. The next slide is regarding Social Security. So a couple links for you to go through here. Social Security is very complex. I do not practice Social Security, so I'm going to give you some basics here, and there's some awesome webinars out there, and there's some links there that explain it. When we talk SSI, that is Supplemental Security Income. And there is a financial test related to that, which is why when you do before the adoption finalization, it's based generally on the birth parents, and it's almost always going to qualify for SSI if the child has a disability. So if you click on those links, they're going to take you to describe what some of those benefits are. If you can get them qualified, get them qualified. There are survivor benefits, which do not terminate. So if a child's parent has died before adoption finalization, they have access to those survivor benefits if that parent had worked enough to create some money so that they can get those death benefits. And if so, even after the adoption finalizes, those survivor benefits do not go away. And those are not overlapping or what we call concurrent benefits. So those are separate and apart for the subsidy, whereas SSI and subsidy are concurrent benefits. And that is the direct language from the Federal Child Welfare Policy Database questions and answers. So what that means is if you're getting, and also in Florida's DCF operating procedures, it has some breakdowns of this. So it's also a very helpful tool to look at this. But ultimately, if you're getting a certain amount from subsidy and a certain amount from SSI, you can't get both. You can get the excess if one is more than the other, but you're not going to get them. They're not going to be able to overlap and then double up. Next slide. School and education, learn about this. If you have your kids in public schools, you want to understand what an IEP is, you want to understand what a 504 is, the distinctions for that. I chose to do unschooling because it's much less stress. My child has twice exceptionality, so he's got highly gifted IQ, but severe anxiety, so school systems don't work with him. Figure out what works for you. They're all private schools that help with this. You can ask for a grant. You can ask for some kind of tuition reduction. You can also apply for the Step Up program, which is basically Step Up special needs scholarships. Go learn about all that stuff. They also, as soon as the application opens up, apply for it so you don't get on the wait list. And the next slide is our Q&A. And then my final thoughts. But for now, we have 15 minutes for Q&A.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to stop the share so we can see you. Well, now you all know why the Florida's Children First webinars are so extremely popular. It was just an amazing amount of information. Thank you so much. Not only great information, but also so many heartfelt practical tips. Just fabulous. So we did have a lot of questions come in. I'm going to let Robin handle most of them because she knows what she's talking about in this arena. So I'm afraid I'll mistranslate as I'm reading questions. So I'll be here in the background.
Great. Thanks, Christy. Awesome job, Maria. I think there are a bunch of questions from folks who are wondering whether their child, how to get their child qualified as special needs if they haven't already been identified, if they feel like in their experience, they know this child does have special needs but hasn't been identified, and how do they get that organized to get that designation?
Well, if it's a special needs under the statute for adoption assistance, then, and they're in care, it's RevMax. So that's their responsibility to apply to get their eligibility. And again, they should be applying for the federal 4E if possible. And so that's not your job to do. If it is APD services or SSI, then again, I think a guardian and attorney ad litem in the system should be helping you understand it and advocate for those things. You're not the expert. Your job and what we ask of you is to be the expert on being a parent, and you're going to learn these things along the way. So push them to say, hey, my kid is doing this and I don't know what that means, right? Like when I said to you, dig deeper, like if you know the birth parent's information and you look them up and they have a criminal charge of DUI during the pregnancy, you have a likely possibility that this child had significant alcohol exposure in utero. I can't guarantee that. And I'm not sure that anybody's going to be 100% able to say that's so, but you have a likely, scenario by which you can advocate for somebody to make that assessment. And you should be bringing it to court. So if you're a foster parent and the child's in your care, or your relative caregiver, something like that, and the case is currently in process, go to court, tell your judge, talk to the guardian, tell them this is important and don't let it go by. When I became a lawyer, I was still anxious about going to court and speaking in front of people. And so I get it. Like sometimes it's not easy to stand up in front of people and say, hey, I want this or need this. But you just have to, like, you literally just have to. And I can't tell you enough that this is the time in your life where you have to toot your own horn. You have to toot your kid's horn. You just have to go after it. And if you don't get it, you keep calling them till they help you understand, or you pay an attorney to do it. The reality is this is becoming your child. And, people say I can't afford private adoptions or things like this. Well, I say, well, you know what? Relook at your budget. Like the pandemic had almost all of us have to relook at our budgets, right? Like I lost half my income immediately. Everything was shutting down. So we realize, hey, what we think we couldn't live without, we can actually live without, right? See if you can get a loan or anything like that. Pay people for their consultations. Even if you can't pay them the big fee, pay people for a $500 consultation. Ask for a neuropsychologist. Ask for those things that you think you need for the kid, and don't let up until you understand and you get it. And if you don't fully get it, see if you can hire somebody who will. But again, push the system, because the case manager has responsibilities, RevMax has responsibilities, the agency has responsibilities, the guardian has responsibilities. If a child's lucky enough to also have an attorney ad litem, say, hey, go on and watch these presentations. Flourish Children First does, not mine, all kinds of incredible presentations.
So Maria, we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to crunch them up. So there's a question basically that has to do with, a child has been placed with them by the agency currently as non-relative caregiver, but if the adoption is, it goes to the question of whether there has to be a finding of unsuccessful effort to place the child without an adoption assistance. Do they have to worry about that? If the child was placed with them as a pre-adoptive home, is there a possibility of them not getting it because they need the adoption assistance?
They're not supposed to shop. That, like, at the end of the day, the agencies are not supposed to be shopping. If they've made an assessment, this is what's in this child's best interest, they have exceptions to that. Go to the operating procedure, so it's in there. If you shoot me an email, I'll find it for you and point it out to you. But I get that fear, like I really get it. But I do think that there's a couple ways you can go about.
They don't need to worry. If they are placed with the agency, I think
they're not allowed to shop around. You're the placement. To remove a child, like, no,
they're not going to do
You can call Florida's Children First. You can call, somebody's going to get on your case and help you.
So the next question has to do with denial of applied behavioral analysis therapy through the Medicaid system. And if that person will contact me afterwards, that's a denial of a Medicaid service. It's appealable, and your local legal aid program can be really helpful in doing that. What name goes on the adoption assistance agreement? Is it the birth name or what the child's adoptive name would be? That's the next question.
They usually put the birth name on the one signed before the adoption is finalized, and then they give you a new one after the adoption is finalized. That's what I usually see.
And we have a couple of questions related to the $1,000 non-recurring expenses. Do they have to use a lawyer? That's recommended by the agency. Is that the maximum that somebody can take? Are filing fee and birth certificate costs included in it? And does it make sense for people to hire their own lawyer earlier in the process? Kind of clump those together.
Yeah, so you can have whoever you want as your attorney. Okay, my recommendation is you have an attorney who's experienced in this and knows what they're doing, and not just paper pushing, which was what the last presentation was about. Your attorney has to decide when you say to them, I want you to represent us, so they can say, well, here's what I charge. And so from what I usually do is I charge half my rate for my foster parents. And then I will say, if you need me for these other additional services, I will charge you by the hour or a cap fee if we agree to that, but that I will do your adoption finalization for the reimbursement rate by the state, inclusive of your court costs, filing fee, birth certificate fees, things like that. Every attorney has the right to decide that on their own, and you just need to make sure you're clear when you're hiring them how they're going to do that, and it should be listed in their engagement agreement.
Yeah. There's a question about the balance in the maximum balance in master trust before benefits get discontinued. So that was the subject of the recent Florida's Children First webinar. When the child is adopted, there is no master trust. The money goes to the parent, the adoptive parent, and there is, depending if it's an asset-based benefit, like Maria was talking about, SSI or APD services, which are part of Medicaid, then there are asset limitations. But it's very complicated and probably not addressable right now.
That's a great training. You guys should watch it. I mean, it's an hour and a half, chock full of information.
There's a family seeking step up for high school, but the child doesn't have a 504 or an IEP. They're retired military, but step up doesn't apply anymore. Tips on getting assistance for high school private tuition.
I am not as familiar, so I can't answer your specifics about that. I thought that you had to have a licensed physician or somebody send a letter, but the tips are to talk to the private school and ask them if they would be willing to reduce their tuition. Even if you get qualified for step up, there's still waiting lists on it too. So just talk to the school and plead your case. And you can also, fundraise for it. Like ask family and friends, would you support, whatever this private school is, in lieu of Christmas gifts or whatever. I mean, look, you're advocating for your kid. Those things are more important than the toys. So, that's my tips, is to just figure out what money, first of all, go to school. Will they reduce it? Will they reduce it if you volunteer some of your time? Work it, negotiate every step of the way.
And there's another resource question. Are there resources for people who are adopted but have since turned 18 and need additional resources for treatment?
Do we know whether or not they have SSI or any other?
There's no other information.
So, I mean, if you're, there's so many variables. I don't know that I can answer that question, but ultimately, if you're over 18 and you need support services and you were adopted, I would still say you can go back to the agency and ask for some support services. They still have a lot of knowledge about what's available in the community. I'm not sure that they're, I'd have to look at, because you didn't technically age out, but I don't know if they're legally required to. Robin, you may know that if the CBC is legally required to provide them services, but I would think that inherent in their mission, their nonprofit institutions, that helping a child who was previously adopted would be something that they could do. But again, you also have the possibility of looking at, you know, are you qualifying for other, you know, things like SSI or whatnot, and Disability Rights Florida, I think, Robin, would be my go-to organization. And you just call them, and they may even have an online one, Robin. I don't know if you know or not, but like just call them or put your name in and say you want to consult, and they will see what they can do for you.
They have good intake, and your, adult child can be on your insurance. So the Medicaid for most adopted children ends at 18, but they can go on your insurance. And if the child had Medicaid prior to 18, the DCF, which handles the eligibility for Medicaid, is supposed to do what they call an ex parte review and see if the child is eligible for Medicaid under any other criteria before dismissing them. So there may be continued Medicaid. I'm going to switch over, Maria. I'm going to try to pull some questions out of the chat. Can a child be adopted by a single individual, and is there a minimum income requirement?
Well, I'm a single mom. I adopted all my 4 kids as a single mom. So yes, you can adopt as a single. And, there's not a specific number of an income. It's really about in the home study process, they are required to assess your family's capacity to provide for your child. And so whether that's you have a ton of money in savings or, some kind of account that you don't have to work, great. If you have a job, is your job, do you have enough in your income to exceed your expenses that you could, pay for a child? It used to be that it was like, oftentimes it was thought of as like what your board rate would be. So $400 to $500 a month in excess of your income exceeding your expenses is what they would make sure you needed to have to provide for a child. As a parent, I can tell you it's more than that to provide for a child. So I think I always think about it like you should be making $1,000 a month per child. But it's not a legal requirement. They just are required to make sure that you have the financial capacity to provide for your child.
Is it true if a family member adopts that they're not offered a subsidy?
No. The only thing that is that the biological parents by federal law can't get a subsidy. If their rights were terminated and then they came back and adopted again, I hate that, but that is federal law. Anybody else can get a subsidy.
When you've requested an enhanced subsidy, what's the time frame the agency has to respond?
Well, I'd have to look back and see if there was a specific date time period, but I don't, my recollection is that there's not a specific date time period. It's a reasonableness. I don't know if Robin, you remember, but look at the operating procedures. That's where you want to look at it. My personal experience is depending upon the CBC and what's happening. Sometimes they're on top of it. And, I've had families waiting for years. So what should be being done is there should be the negotiation discussion about what your family needs. But yeah, I think I've seen a range.
At what point can an adoptive parent work with their 17-year-old to apply for SSI? And will that be based on the parent's income or the youth?
The underage, it should be the SSI is based upon the parent's income. And any time that you think that your child would qualify for SSI, you should look at that. And then you should also talk to a special needs planning attorney about how to consider, what your income is. Is there something that you could shift or change that might have them qualify? Again, like that's part of how do you plan for taking care of your whole family. If you have a child who isn't going to be able to be on their own and you're looking at their needing to be a guardianship post 18, you want to start that stuff while they're 17. And there's the guardian advocate process, which is a lot easier to do. So and I think immediately, if you think that your child will qualify for SSI, you figure that out.
And that there's a series of related questions concerning guardianship for a young adult who's post 18. And I typed in an answer. I don't know if y'all can find it. There is a website called Turning 18, It's the number 18.org, and it's specifically intended to help parents of young people who may have capacity issues to figure out what the appropriate process is, because the presumption is you turn 18, you are capable of making your own decisions. So that's a good local resource for everybody, turning18.org. Okay, I'm going to sneak in the last one. If the child came to us from a level 2 medical foster home, should we be seeking an enhanced subsidy? Child has a lifelong disability. Case management says diagnosis isn't disability.
If the child was in a level 2 medical home, did the child's needs change when the child came to your home is one of the first questions. Is it a step down? Like, did the child have medical needs that are now shifted down? And then secondly, does your family have the capacity to finalize the adoption without the subsidy, right? I mean, you know, the subsidy, the goal is to not have to enhance every home the child is being adopted into. So I would have to look at all those factors, but generally speaking, if there's not a step down and your family needs that support, then you should be asking for what the child was getting or what the child should be getting.
I'm going to sneak one more in if we can get your time on it. So what's your experience in seeing sort of out of the box requests for subsidy supports, things like marriage counseling or support animals? How often do you see DCF approve those kinds of requests? And how do you gather documents to support those kinds of requests?
Well, first of all, you definitely need assessments or documents to show that whatever it is that you think you need will in fact relate to helping your child and helping your family stay intact. And so I would gather whatever documents would show that there's been success, that this provider has had success, that you're qualified for this. Here's why. This child has this is the diagnosis, and the prognosis is better if the family has these kinds of supports. I would have to draw those linkages to make that happen. My experience is that once you get to the DCF attorneys, they are able to hear things better, but that's not always looked at before you get the denial. And so you have to build those cases. If you don't have the documents to prove those kinds of things, even it's never going to be a complete causal approval, like proving A to B. But if you have enough to show that that's supportive and your family's really in crisis and that's going to help, then you would pitch it. The question then ends up being, is this a time limited need versus a long-term need? And if it's a long-term need, then that's where you look at a regular monthly enhancement to your rate versus we need help now. And we have identified these vendors, these providers, and then you go to your CBC and say, is there any extra funds in that pocket of, in that bucket to provide these kinds of things? And so, well, hopefully that's helpful, but I think there's some analysis that would have to be done.
Thanks, Maria. We are over time. You are awesome. Thanks for everyone, your great questions and participating. If you put something in the chat and we didn't get to it, I'm sorry, but Maria did an awesome job for us.
She sure did. And thank you, Robin, for connecting us with Maria for this great training and for being a stellar co-host, keeping up with everything. I just typed in the CLE number, but I did want to say it out loud too. It's 2107840N. Again, that's 2107840N. I'll send that out with the materials. I've been making notes everywhere in my terrible handwriting about websites to include with the follow-up. Make sure you check out the YouTube channel. We put that in the chat, and I'll put that in the follow-up email also. There's a whole child welfare playlist with Robin and other rock stars, so don't miss any of those. Thank you so much, Maria and Robin, and thank you everyone who attended. I hope you have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.